Hi, and good afternoon. This is Chip Epps with ReversingLabs, and I'd like to, first and foremost, thank Kayan for inviting ReversingLabs to participate in this Cyber Leadership and Strategy Solutions event. And I'd like to thank you all for participating as well. Today we're going to talk about an idea of rethinking enterprise file analysis. And this is obviously in the context of cyber, but I think there are actually bigger implications beyond just the security operations teams per se, which is in many respects the fundamental premise of this case for a malware lab. And so with that, let's sort of jump in. The agenda, I guess first and foremost, I want to set the stage. What are some of the strategic directions and challenges that face organizations, and what's sort of spawned this conversation? Then I talk about why a malware lab. In other words, in the context of a file-centric threat management program, why a malware lab? What are some of the drivers? Where are the weaknesses? What are the new solution approaches to solve some of the problems that the malware lab is intended to solve? And then what is a malware lab? And then I want to talk about the ReversingLabs malware lab solution and our proposition. What I would almost argue is the getting started for many organizations sort of solution set. And so, the reality is today, and various executives from various software companies have echoed this, but over the last decade plus, we've been going through this digital transformation, and I think it's even more evident today as a result of the last year and a half going through the pandemic, as businesses look to transform themselves when they can't have a physical presence or have customers within a traditional brick and mortar type of environment, and the opportunity to leverage these almost next day logistics solutions to get products quickly turned around in almost a touchless type of an environment. And so you're seeing digital lines of businesses emerge as e-commerce sites develop, various online customer support portals, partner portals. You can go through a litany of different scenarios where a new digital presence has emerged. People would argue that every business today is a software development company in response to that. And so you're seeing the ongoing emergence of I'll call it the DevOps type business models within the software development lifecycle. You're also seeing the convergence of development and security and what is often referred to as DevSecOps. Traditionally, IT departments or businesses that had computers and resources and were exposed to risk would aggregate those or centralize alerts, escalate them in a security operations center, and that's where the bulk of the analysis had been done relative to files. And they have been one of the primary drivers behind, maturing the ability and capacity of organizations to actually understand the behavior of malware so they can actually be more defensible. But again, there's a lot of other constituents. We're seeing ongoing maturity of threat hunting programs, and so the threat hunters are using the data in response to this analysis. And you're seeing audit and compliance being more active. And I think of, particularly in response to SolarWinds, what can they do to mitigate vendor risk as they consume more and more third-party software? And what's even more critical as they themselves become software supply or software development organizations, they are using other software supply chain channels, open source and the like, to build their own software. And so they don't have a really good sense, a good manifest of the software that's being used. And more importantly, they don't understand or have visibility into the potential risk. In other words, is that software from a trusted source? Do they have, diligent practices in place to ensure that their software is clean of malware, clean of defects? And so there's this just ongoing demand for, look, we need to understand the digital content that's coming into our organization. And our argument is that digital content is embodied in files or potentially objects, which is, think of objects as more compounded scenarios where you're getting multiple files in one digital entity or object. And then attackers will begin to see that as an opportunity. They will find these large objects or digital files, look at those as opportunities to obfuscate and hide their payloads and ride on the coattails of, could be software updates, could be email attachments, whatever the scenario, whatever the potential attack vector, to get their attacks through traditional security controls and into the environments of these businesses. And we've seen the likes of ransomware obviously on the rise, and a variety of other things. And these organizations, these criminal syndicates, these nation states are getting incrementally more sophisticated in their attacks. And so there's just, I think, a fundamental sense that businesses need to have almost a center of excellence around understanding the digital threats to their business. And so one of the original drivers for this premise of a malware lab actually stems from a very traditional model. I'll call it the current state, where every business today is instrumenting their infrastructure through a variety of security controls. Maybe it's in response to some NIST cybersecurity framework and set of recommendations, but they're saying, look, we've got to put security controls in place. I would say, the fundamental one being something like antivirus. But they don't have any good visibility into how effective those controls are. In other words, they really don't have a good sense of, okay, are they getting 25% of the files? Are they looking at 25% of the potential risk, 35%? At best, maybe 50%, I think is kind of where we're seeing the data show. But anyway, there's this realm on the left relative to the current state where they're making these investments, but they just don't know how effective they are. And what is it? Security budgets are often maybe 10%, 5 to 10% of the IT budget, which is then maybe another 5 to 10% of the revenue of the company, if you will. And so there's a lot of money that's being spent there. Those infrastructure controls are going to generate alerts, and the Security Information Event Management Console, or the SIM, is going to gather that. And just like any, like the old sitcom MASH, they're going to get this flood of alerts, and they've got to go through some sort of triage, identify what the most important things are, and escalate those up for some sort of response. And so the SIM is struggling with the fact that they've got too many alerts that they can actually filter through. And the stats suggest that the reality is over 50% of those alerts simply go unaddressed, uninvestigated. That's because there's, again, a flood of false positives, the sheer volume. They don't have good visibility. They don't have good data to make the right decisions. And again, many of those alerts are going to be file-based from endpoint detection and response systems or other platforms. And so those escalations ultimately will move into the SOAR. Now the question is do they really have the right intelligence, specifically related to local threats? Yeah, they can go out and look at what, from third parties, what sort of dark web intelligence has been gathered outside their business. But for those targeted attacks inside their organization, they're going to lack the intelligence unless they have a local analysis type of capability to then make decisions and define response playbooks to get these attacks under control. And now there's a lot of other techniques and plugins that they're adding to the, that vendors or enterprises are adding to this solution set. They're looking at highly curated threat feeds, which I would argue come from the most trusted and confident sources, tend to be those that are frontline providers. And I say frontline, those are the guys or the teams from the likes of the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, maybe if you're in a particular industry that has an ISAC, one of the ISAC teams. But ultimately, they're looking to aggregate all this threat intelligence to provide some insights to both the incident responders as well as the triage analysts. And so the idea is that a lot of analysis in almost a firefighting mode is done within the Security Operations Center today. But our argument is that, look, there needs to be some malware analysis to serve all the constituents that we previously had discussed, and the Security Operations Center as well. And so what we've seen is, and I try to highlight this a little bit to the right, is they just don't have a commercial set of tools that does a very good job on a malware analysis side. They may have some sandboxes or some open source tools that can provide, or shareware tools that can do some static analysis, but it's not really institutionalized. It's not very well supported, and more importantly, it's not automated. And so what we see is analysts today, which are often those incident responders that are operating within the SOC, double tasking as malware analysts. It may take them upwards of a day to actually analyze one file. Now, if you're an enterprise receiving tens of thousands of alerts today, and even assuming you can filter through the bulk of the false positives very quickly, you're not in a position from just a staffing perspective to scrub through all the potential malware suspicious files that are coming into your organization based on that type of productivity. You can't do that at that scale. And so the argument is, why a malware lab, which ultimately suggests, what can I do to get my throughput beyond one file a day per analyst? And so again, as a reminder, over 50% of attacks, or alerts, I should say, I don't say attacks, alerts are actually investigated. And this number, in the latest research from Cisco in their latest security benchmark study, was the lowest level in 4 years that were investigated. And this trend continues to grow. And given the cyber landscape that we've seen over the last year, the fear is that it's going to get worse, I think, which was a driver for having a conversation around the malware lab. And so the file situation is this, and this represents the corpus from our global repository, which happens, ReversingLabs is in a proud position to be that we actually have the world's largest repository of curated files which have been classified. It's in excess of 12 billion files, which is why we're a tremendous value add provider just to enrich other third-party systems. But the reality is, amongst that corpus of files that we have, this is sort of the breakdown. There's the idea of high trust files and low trust files. And we will often say those are going to be those that we know to be from trusted organizations that have been analyzed by our systems and shown to be, and from known trusted sources that we know to be good. And it's important to have whitelisted contents, or what I'll say, visibility into the goodware, because if you can, in the analysis process, and again, if you're looking to process tens, if not hundreds of thousands of files a day, if not millions, in some of our customers' scenarios, if you can immediately look at the files based on a hash, as an example, and determine them that they're from a known high trust source, you can move them into a particular category and not burden the rest of your analysis system and with analysis, and actually avoid the false positive scenario, which is essentially saying I've declared something good to actually be bad when in fact that's wrong. And so you can alleviate a lot of the overhead by knowing or maintaining this perspective of having insight into goodware. But now, where the challenge comes from a suspicious or malicious perspective, these low trust or known bad scenarios, is that you've got to do some analysis. And it's not good enough to simply say we think it's bad, or we're not sure. There are actually various levels of bad as well, and you'll see that I think in one of our later screenshots. And so this spectrum here really requires a good set of analysis tools and the level of detail or visibility into the particular threats, and I would argue a level of transparency and an understanding of various relevant indicators that help drive certain classifications, because you want to impart to the analysts and the community that wants to consume this information some degree of confidence, and quite honestly, being as transparent as possible about how you came to a conclusion gives them greater confidence on how they should behave and act in response to that. And so, just given this broader spectrum, I always say, look, 50% of the files that you're going to see coming into your organization are going to be good and from trusted sources. The other 50% are going to definitely warrant some level of analysis. Now, I always say statistics may vary, but let's just use this as a benchmark. And so, from a ReversingLabs perspective, we're not just seeing the spectrum of files, but even within the realm of the broader corpus, some of the challenges at a very, very general level are continuing to expand. It used to be very discrete files, and I think of media files as a classic example, right? In the days, okay, we had this little simple image, and it was 20K or something like that, and then they got richer and richer, and you wanted more and more resolution, and then you wanted multimedia, and then you wanted multimedia with various tracks, to support various languages or formats, and then you said, well, why don't we just roll them all together and distribute a collection in some sort of compacted or packed file, and then now we're seeing, hey, look, we want to archive more and more of our digital content in case there's let's say a ransomware attack or some other disaster that we need to recover from. So files themselves are just getting incrementally larger and more complex. And so that's both a size, and when I say complexity, I'm thinking more in a scenario of being recursively packed, consistent of a variety of different formats, as an example. And so broader file formats is another specific topic that we call, or category that we call out in this realm of challenges. But we're also seeing, as efforts have been underway for quite some time to provide a trust chain for certificates. The reality is certificates they themselves be malformed and expired as the continued use of those grow. And then we're seeing more third-party or open source content contributing to various digital objects, digital content, as the need to share and accelerate development or delivery of digital material and digital code and digital software continues to grow. And so this paradigm, as digital content gets larger, more diverse, is that it actually, in many respects, breaks down many traditional security controls. Classic example would be, let's just argue, antivirus will not look at files or digital objects larger than 200 megabyte. It's just it's a resource boundary, if you will. Similarly, they're going to say, look, if you've recursively packed content within one of these objects more than 5 times, we just can't expend the energy to continually drill down and drill down and drill down and drill down to get down to the fundamental components or objects within these larger objects, if you will. And so the reality is traditional security measures, and I would argue that includes antivirus and in many cases sandboxes, are not able to respond fast enough to these growing trends around, I would say, the digital content in files and objects. And so the state of file analysis today generally relies on sandboxes or dynamic analysis. And the origins go back to the 70s on this, where developers in the early days said, look, we're building software, we don't know if it's going to work, or we want to understand to make sure that it works. As you go through that first compile, you just simply want to run it somewhere, but you don't want to corrupt your own system, so you ran it somewhere else in a contained environment, and that was the early sort of permanent, establishment of a sandbox concept. Now that quickly obviously moved into the security realm, where they said, look, let's execute these things in contained environments. But then what they saw quickly was, look, we've got more files that we want to quote unquote detonate in these contained environments. We can't buy that many PCs to support that. So we're going to start to virtualize these virtualize these environments. One, so they can create, if they can run let's say a Windows server, but then they can run a variety of virtual machines for a variety of operating systems, they can get that scalability. But quickly, attackers realized they could detect whether these were going to run in a virtual environment, and then they could actually evade those, and apply or disable certain capabilities to evade detection in those environments. And so Sandboxes have a variety of limitations. First and foremost, will my file run or execute in the sandbox? In other words, do I have the operating environment and the resourcing to meet the minimum requirements for the executable to run, if you will, the binary to run? Do I have adequate number of systems to support this? If I can't have one system with hundreds of VMs on it, how can I possibly support bare metal systems at the scale that I'm going to need to support the analysis of all these files coming into my organization? Do the systems I have, are they actually susceptible to evasion techniques? But ultimately what it gets down to is the cost per analysis is too prohibitive for sandboxes today. And so I think creative minds got together and said, well, let's go out, let's move away from this dynamic approach, and why can't we just simply disassemble, if you will, or decompose or extract the data statically? In other words, let's just take the binary and through static analysis break it apart and analyze it there and look for potential quote unquote indicators that would flag the file as being able to exhibit bad behaviors were it to run. And so static analysis merged. Now, what's interesting in the realm of static analysis is that it sort of evolved in a very academic way. In other words, someone went to solve one problem, they created a tool, a shareware resource, and then maybe it became an open source project. But there was, it's all been done manually, and it's also been a variety of different tools that have evolved over time. And this is just, the table at the bottom here just illustrates that, where in the area of, and I did my best to sort of group these, and it varies a little bit, but hey, I want to be able to identify the object that I'm going to decompose or extract data from. And that would be, programs like PEView would be one. You'll see a variety of others. Similarly, I want to go through this process of unpacking my files. And now a lot of this is sort of embodied in things like software composition analysis, reverse engineering, you name it. But the reality is proven to be that if you want to go through this process and try to work through all these manual tools, it could take upwards of 7 hours. And this is, this echoes where we were before, which is analysts can analyze one file a day. And so this is one of those classic scenarios where they're doing certain activities manually, they're applying certain tools to do certain things throughout the process, and they're then, they themselves are trying to apply their expertise, digest all this information and say, oh, we think this is not only bad, but it's bad in the context of being let's just, a ransomware attack, and that ransomware in the context of being this particular family of ransomware. Maybe it's, there's all kinds of families up there in the ransomware world. But so manual static analysis is solving the problem that we see in dynamic analysis, but it's too time consuming. And so what ReversingLabs did said, look, there's an opportunity here to commercialize this, to automate it, and scale from a deployment perspective to meet the demands of, tens, hundreds, millions of files per day. And so from a ReversingLabs perspective, we've gotten this whole process down to to sub-second time to go through the process of decomposing, identifying, decomposing, unpacking, or extracting, if you will, enriching, which is ultimately gathering the metadata, and then doing the analysis through a variety of, machine learning and other alternative analysis classification engines. And so we support over 40 integrations today. We've got a lot of open connectors to things like ICAP and IMAP and S3 and NFS, things like that. We can churn through very large files. We support over 400 unpacking formats, or packed formats, I should say, so we have the ability to unpack that. We support nearly, I would say, arguably infinite number of recursions from a packing perspective. We support over 4,000 formats, whether they're PE, Linux, Mac, Android, iOS. There's a variety of different environments that we support. We even support some firmware in certain scenarios. But then we also, as we go through that extraction process and get down to the fundamental metadata of every one of these binaries, we actually then translate that into human readable indicators, which are essentially one of the key attributes that security practitioners are looking for. Indicators, just think of indicators as some description of potential behavior were the file to run, and then we map those into the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And so automating the process and getting this level of scalability and performance is the only path forward in order to meet the demands of the need to analyze all this digital content. And so this ultimately set the premise for, look, we need to move into this Malware Lab scenario, have all those different service entities or elements of the business that required digital analysis to participate in this process. And so I would argue it's time to get serious about Malware Lab and putting your organization on the front line to understand your adversaries. And so some of the questions you might want to ask yourself, what about my files? What types of formats do I have in my environment? What versions, and I'll just use Office as an example. Do I have doc files? Do I have XLS files? What versions? Do I have to support a deprecated history? What exists in my archives that I need to be concerned about? Because files, that might have been good 1 year ago, 2 years ago, might be shown to be not good today. They might be bad, and so you want to understand how far back you need to go. You need to understand what sort of operating environments that you need to support. Are they packed or compressed? How many levels? Archives would be classic examples to look at. Maybe there's some other installation packages to be concerned about as a result or an output from the DevOps process. Containers would be a classic example. How large are they? Will they exceed my existing security controls today? Are there digital certificates involved? Is code being signed? Are my applications good? Do I know the quality of the software? Who wrote that software? What sort of testing did it go through? Do I have third-party software? In other words, how can I trust, and looking at SolarWinds as a classic example, and we've seen a lot of updater attacks where people sort of blindly trust software updates when in fact, if it's coming directly from the vendor and if malware impacted them, it just sort of is a pass-through. And so do you have a software bill of materials to give you some level of visibility and confidence into the software that's being used, that's been produced from outside parties? Another set of challenges would be, hey, look, do I, from an operational perspective, where are my files being stored? What's the volume of them? Is it terabytes, petabytes? What is it? Do I have any intelligence at all? Do I have quality feeds to give me visibility into current threats? Do I trust them? Am I confident in the source? What do I have to do to analyze not just the files that I have, but reanalyze files over time? So again, addressing that problem where things change over time as new information emerges, new understandings about various tactics, techniques, and procedures from certain attack groups emerge, and we have greater understanding. What can I do to sort of retrospectively go back and look at historical files? Do I feel confident in the classifications? So there's a lot of things to set the stage and that I would argue warrant having some level of center of excellence, some sort of institutionalized group, team, service, if you will, that can serve this. And we're just sort of embodying that under the concept of a malware lab. And so what is a malware lab? I think it's a service group, if you will, that can serve all these entities. Think of it as a centralized malware analysis resource with the corresponding security infrastructure to support the ongoing investigation, research, and including threat hunting. The ability to consolidate all these skills and expertise, and I would argue also the tools and the data in one location. And so there's greater efficiencies and scale, and I would say efficacy and effectiveness that can happen in response to that. It does sort of streamline your workflows as well. It provides that single point of content across all these organizations, optimizes the business, and again, I think it creates this service team for all the digital departments that require file analysis. And so, simple line diagram. Well, maybe it's not so simple. Illustrating this, I would say a lot of the traditional file analysis has been done in a reactive state as a part of security operations. In other words, some alert comes in, you've got a particular hash of a file that the system suspects is bad. It could have been generated by an endpoint detection and response system, or a variety of different controls that exist in the infrastructure. But the early organizational models where, look, the security operations team is in place to respond to threats. So we had the incident response plans in place, and they needed more intelligence in order to formulate that response, and that's where the analysis happened. I think the argument is look, the incident responders themselves are really focused on the response part. They're not deep analysis and file analysis, or I would argue threat intelligence experts. I almost look at the operations is in their name, security operations, and so they're really concerned about keeping the business running in response to various security threats. And so our argument is maybe we move this idea of file analysis or threat analysis outside of the SOC, but obviously the SOC is a primary customer of that group. And so this malware lab has emerged as a prospective solution to all this, where now you've got the analysts that can work against, I would say, 5 key components to optimize what they do every day. And we would say this malware lab is this getting started process that I think will lead to some more strategic initiatives, which we'll talk about. But in the malware lab, let's say there's 5 key components. There's going to be this concept of having a unified threat analysis set of engines, and we'll talk about that a little bit deeper here in just a second. But then the result of all that analysis is that you actually manage a repository of local and global intelligence. Now, local obviously is going to be very specific to you, but obviously you can incorporate a lot of other global intelligence. As an example from ReversingLabs, we would have our global repository always available. And so you can do your analysis locally, you can pull samples from the cloud or other intelligence from the cloud and bring it into the same repository of intelligence. Now, some other infrastructure elements that would support this would be the idea of having, I'll call it a data lake that would represent a repository for all the metadata that's being extracted from all the analysis outputs. You would have a file lake as a secure malware locker, if you will, to store your samples or your files that you know to be bad in particular. And then you have a set repository, if you will, of or a catalog of ongoing YAR rules. Think of that as a set of rule sets in a very simple language that you can apply to that normalized data in order to extract visibility into potential threats. YARA can be used for both optimizing detection, in other words, looking to detect threats, but also for hunting for new threats or various hidden threats, I should say. And so those 5 elements, I would argue, embody the foundation of the malware lab. As you continue to extract data, you can feed not just the SOC or other lines of business. I would say that the chief digital team, or the chief digital officer, and the digital team responsible for the external web. I'll call it e-commerce environment. But you can then take the findings from that information and push those security insights into the infrastructure and controls to make them a little bit more defensible in a much more proactive way. And so the details behind the malware lab itself, again, these 5 components, and we've spoken to them, but just to zoom in a little bit more, from a unified threat analysis, I'm going to talk a little bit about the consolidation of automated static analysis and dynamic analysis. And so the popular analysis tools that you've used in the past, they still have a role to play from a runtime perspective, but make sure that you can automate the static analysis, because you get a 10x factor increase in the number of indicators. You get greater throughput and scale. And so the combination of the marriage of those two that also share a common metadata schema, and naming and classification structure is the benefit of unifying this analysis stack. You also then, you've got your intelligence repo, if you will, a database that allows you to support the enrichment from a threat intelligence perspective of various other resources in the organization or controls in the infrastructure. And then you've got this other infrastructure to the left to support the ongoing analysis and hunting in a very secure fashion. And so the ReversingLabs Malware Lab solution is one that suggests that you start with our malware analysis workbench solution. We call it our A1000. And I would argue this is the getting started malware lab. It's a turnkey solution. It allows you to consume or ingest files, submit manually if you so choose, but it does support a variety of integrations to the sources that we have spoken to. It actually supports its own engine, but it also, analysis engine, but it also shares a like engine in the ReversingLabs Titanium Cloud, but it also benefits from gathering insights from those global file repository. I'll call it those global files that have been analyzed in that Titanium Cloud repository. And so I think that combination fits well with what we've defined as the malware lab. Now, as you grow your initiatives to look at how you deal with digital content, you can escalate or significantly expand your malware lab analysis to actually put it within the infrastructure so that you can actually extend that elastically. And that would be our Titanium Scale product. And I would encourage you just simply to set up a call with one of our ReversingLabs reps, and I'll share with you how to do that here at the end. To drill into this, because there's a lot of breadth within the portfolio that can support, but our primary focus is on this getting started with a malware lab and leveraging the malware analysis workbench. And so in the unified stack, and I would call it the single platform, we generally refer to the ReversingLabs solution here as the Titanium platform. But we're going to be, again, consuming files, and from a analysis perspective, we've got automated static analysis, dynamic analysis, and then additionally the ability to do some analysis relative to those digital certificates and other potential network components. Think of classic callouts, IPs, URLs, and the like, to ensure that those sources out on the network are actually safe. And so you can do that analysis automatically within the Titanium platform. Once you go through the process of extracting the metadata, we take that metadata and derive human readable indicators of compromise, or IOCs. And there's thousands of indicators that we generate, quite honestly. We take those indicators, which are we declare them to be human readable, and I'll illustrate that here in a second. We pass them through our explainable machine learning classification engines, and from that we derive a classification, and we will profess that our classifications embody what we call explainable threat intelligence, and there's a whole separate conversation around that, but we in a very simple term, we say explainable threat intelligence is what we would say you're going to get a more transparent or glass box output versus what we're seeing from many vendors as a black box scenario. But it's that added transparency and visibility and understanding of how we came to a classification, which is the valuable part, and then translating that in very understandable or explainable language to the practitioners. But then finally, this platform, if you will, Titanium platform, maps these indicators, which I would say often are the security analyst's language, into the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which is often going to be the security operational language. And so this all proceeds in a very simple process. Files come in, and I would argue all files that are in need of being analyzed. And my argument, quite honestly, is that all digital objects entering a business should be analyzed. But whatever your input or whatever the files that you want to source are, they'll all be processed through automated static analysis. And then only those files of interest will move into that scenario where the cloud the sandboxing technologies can support and quite honestly can cost effectively process. Now, the nice thing is ReversingLabs now offers a cloud sandbox available to customers in the same platform environment that's fully integrated. But I don't want to marginalize that. You've already made some investments in other sandbox technologies. I think my argument is that you can downsize those to optimize that sandbox requirement in a much more cost-effective way, and then reallocate that into some other investments. And we have integrations to support that. But ideally, we're saying static analysis can optimize what you have in your current investments from a sandbox. You're going to gain even greater efficiencies by leveraging a fully integrated or native cloud sandbox from ReversingLabs. And so this would be, I think, the prospect of optimizing analysis as part of the Malware Lab. And so just to help you visualize all this different types of data that we've talked about, the far left illustrates what one of these open source tools would produce as a result of their extraction from a particular binary. This happens to be PEView, which is a common tool for Windows portable executable files. But you can see it just simply says, hey, look, we've stripped out a variety of parameters from various sections within the binary. But in most cases, only well-seasoned practitioners can interpret some of the hex and the other values that exist or derive from that extraction to make an assessment of how that file might behave. Now, what ReversingLabs has done is we've gone through that metadata and translated it into these human-readable indicators, and you can see that we've got evasion. Well, there's a variety of attributes, values that indicated the following behaviors, and we put it in simple English. Disabled services related to common security products. Okay, that's definitely an indicator of potential risk, bad behavior, if you will. Now we take those indicators and we actually run them through our explainable machine learning classification engines, and the output from that will say this particular FASH or set of indicators is indicative of a dark comet backdoor, as an example, and we'll provide some additional context and descriptive information in response to that. But we'll also take those same indicators and map them to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which is the sort of like the master matrix from a security operations perspective, of the attack lifecycle and the behaviors you could expect to see, or activity, the tactics, techniques, and procedures you could expect to see in response to that. And so that's a great tool from the security practitioners. And again, we think it's best to consolidate all this within a malware lab so that all the digital customers have a place to have their files and potentially destructive objects analyzed. And so this would be a simple illustration from the malware analysis workbench from ReversingLabs that all I really wanted to show here is, hey, here's the simple detection summary, classification summary dashboard. But more importantly, I wanted to just illustrate more toward the bottom the fact that we're leveraging local static analysis in the cloud sandbox from the malware, being generated from the malware lab, but we're also leveraging additional cloud threat intelligence from Titanium Cloud. And so that would be the, again, the global perspective from a malware lab and local global threat intelligence perspective. And so the benefits of the malware lab, I generally look at this in three categories: people, process, technology. Hey, let's consolidate expertise, provide an environment to optimize the skills that we have, and optimize the training and upskilling of our analysts and researchers today, and then essentially create this center of excellence. In other words, people are well trained, they know how to behave and respond, they've got the tools in place to do things right, and it serves the entire business. From a process perspective, it centralizes an escalation point relative to, we've got suspicious files we don't know what to do with, please help. It optimizes the business and the security workflows associated with these types of processes. I would argue it creates this universal service team that serves all these digital business entities, and it helps consolidate metrics to better support operational efficiencies, but to form a foundation for risk analysis. Now, from a technology perspective, unifying some of these technologies means you can continue to consolidate your tools, and I would argue upgrade to the latest and greatest threat analysis set of capabilities. Unifying all this data centralizes visibility into the attack malware that might exist inside your organization. Providing the utmost intelligence creates a level of trust that then supports automation. A whole separate topic that we haven't drilled into, but it's the ability to create early warning capabilities. A lot of this is facilitated around better understanding your adversaries and how they might attack your organization, so that you can take proactive measures and create a more defensible posture in advance of those attacks. And then lastly, it helps streamline the auditing response process, which everybody hates being hit by an audit because it distracts everybody to reassemble the data and build the reports to fulfill that limited window of time to respond. But if you've already done a lot of that work, or the systems in the malware lab have already gathered all that data, and it makes it easier to respond, all the better. I put a little quote from a Gartner peer insight just to illustrate the fact that we are seeing this materialize in our customer base. They said ReversingLabs converted us to be proactive rather than reactive, which is, I think, in many respects, one of the primary objectives of the malware lab. And so given that, I know we're not necessarily taking questions, but I would encourage you to go to our website, reversinglabs.com. You can download a variety of resources, including our white paper on the new explainable threat intelligence. We've got thousands, well, maybe not thousands, but a lot, I'll leave it at that, of various videos in various locations. We've got Learning with ReversingLabs on our website. We've got some great videos on our YouTube channel. But ultimately, encourage you just to, contact us, go to the demo button on reversinglabs.com, do a quick registration. We'd be glad to have a conversation with you about the malware lab concept, what customers are seeing, and more importantly, show you what the malware analysis workbench looks like and how it can serve your needs. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, give you some resources to contact us or communicate with us or follow us, and have a great day. And for Kayan and the group at CLASS, thank you very much for inviting us. Have a great event. Thanks.